In the mountains of Colorado, there's a valley so beautiful, it looks like something a painter invented. Timber frame chalets with walls of glass, heated driveways, panoramic windows framing peaks that turn pink at sunset and white at dawn. From the air, it looks like paradise. From the ground, in the right kind of winter, it looks like something else entirely. This is a story about the difference. In the corner of one backyard, between the manicured landscaping and the property line, there is a structure that does not belong. Gray concrete, rough granite, no windows, a steel door the color of a storm cloud. The neighbors called it an eyesore. They filed complaints, signed petitions, laughed. A 64-year-old woman built it anyway, alone, in 11 weeks. With arthritic hands, she soaked in warm water every morning before she could hold a clipboard. She didn't build it because she wanted to be right. She built it because she already knew what was coming. And somewhere in the pocket of her flannel shirt, folded into quarters, was a piece of paper that explained everything. The town of Crescent Ridge, Colorado, had a rule, not a written rule, not the kind you'd find in a municipal code or a homeowners association handbook, though those existed too, in 3-ring binders with color-coded tabs. This rule was older than that, quieter. It went something like this: beauty was safety, glass was progress, and if you could see the mountains from every room in your house, you had made it. Nobody questioned it. Nobody needed to. The night her husband stopped answering, Veradis Cole was 36 years old. She called his name 4 times. After that, she stopped counting. What she remembers, what she has always remembered, with the particular cruelty of a memory that refuses to soften, is not the cold, not the sound of the roof giving way, not even the darkness which was absolute and total, and the kind of black that makes you wonder briefly if your eyes are still open. What she remembers is the silence after, the way it settled, like it had been waiting. Robert had gone to check the generator. That was all. 20 feet from the back door, maybe 30, a walk he had made 100 times, and the snow had been coming down hard. Yes, the wind had been doing something strange. Yes, she had watched the needle on her father's old barometer drop through the afternoon faster than she'd ever seen it move, and she had said something to Robert about it, something careful and half-formed, because she didn't want to sound afraid. He had kissed her on the forehead and told her he'd be right back. He was not right back. The roof went 20 minutes later. Not the whole roof, just the northeast corner, the section over the living room, where the snow load had been building since noon. The beam that saved her life was the same beam that trapped her. 12 inches of old-growth Douglas fir pinning her left leg to the floor, while the world above her collapsed into a white, suffocating silence. She was there for 6 hours. She knows this because she counted. When the rescue crew finally reached her, she was still conscious, still counting. Her leg was broken in 2 places, her face was cut from flying debris, and her husband, Robert Allen Cole, 41 years old, the man who kissed her forehead and told her he'd be right back, was found 12 feet from the generator. He had almost made it back. Almost. That was 28 years ago. Now she lived in Crescent Ridge in a house that was older than everything around it, with a barometer on the wall and a coffee mug she never let anyone else touch, and a set of hands that had to be soaked in warm water every morning before they would agree to open properly. She didn't tell people about the hands. Why would she? Her father had been a tunnel man. That was the word he used, not engineer, not contractor. Tunnel man. He'd spent 30 years boring through the Appalachians for railway lines and mountain roads, and he had taught Veradis, his only child, the things he considered essential knowledge: how to read stone, how to understand load, how to look at a wall and know without being told whether it would hold. You don't learn that from a book, he'd say. You learn it from standing next to something that holds and feeling why, and then from standing next to something that doesn't, and surviving that too. She had gotten her engineering degree at 30, worked for 20 years on structural projects across the West, retired at 57, which was not her choice, it was the arthritis. The same arthritis that made her mornings into small private negotiations between herself and her own fingers. She had moved to Crescent Ridge because it was beautiful, she had stayed because it was home, and she had started watching the barometer more carefully because she was not going to let the mountains kill anyone else she loved. The problem with that plan was that she didn't love anyone in Crescent Ridge. Not yet. The trouble began on a Tuesday in early September when the flatbed trucks arrived. Daxwell Pruitt saw them first. He was on his wraparound deck, mahogany, obviously sealed against moisture, with a product that cost more per gallon than most people paid for wine, drinking something from a glass that had a leaf pattern etched into it, because that was the kind of detail Daxwell Pruitt paid attention to. He was 42 years old. He wrote code for a company whose product he described at dinner parties as basically a next-generation interface for collaborative workflow optimization, which meant no one ever asked follow-up questions, which was exactly what he wanted. He looked at the trucks. The trucks looked back. This was weathered logs that had gone gray, a porch with 2 broken boards, shutters hanging at angles that suggested the screws had given up professionally, a metal roof with a rust pattern that looked like a map of somewhere. Tall weeds had taken over everything within reach. The chimney had moss on it. The whole structure had a slight lean to the left, like it was tired and considering sitting down. And it was hers, sort of, apparently. Then he walked across the property line in his deck shoes, Italian suede, absolutely wrong for anything resembling outdoor terrain, and found her standing at the edge of a freshly excavated pit, wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, and holding a clipboard like she'd been born with one in her hand, which in a way she had. Veradis. He said her name like a question. What on earth is happening? She didn't look up from the clipboard. Good morning, Daxwell. That's granite. It is. That is a lot of granite. I'm aware. He waited. She did not elaborate. He tried again. Is this, are you putting in a pool? She looked up then. Gray eyes. The kind of gray that has always been gray. Not the gray of something that was once another color and faded. Just gray. A shelter, she said. A shelter. He repeated it back to her the way people repeat things when they need a moment to recalibrate. Like an underground shelter. Yes. Like, He laughed. It was a short laugh, a surprised at itself kind of laugh. Like a doomsday bunker, a storm shelter, she corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. She turned back to her clipboard. The difference is whether you think the world is ending or whether you think the weather is. He stood there a moment longer. Veradis. Daxwell. I have a Tesla in my driveway, and your concrete mixer is generating approximately, he looked at the dust cloud spreading across the property line, a lot of dust. She considered this. I'll tell Luis to angle it. Thank you. You're welcome. He left, and Veradis Cole went back to reading her clipboard, and the granite kept coming, and the hole in her backyard got deeper. She had already called Luis in September, before the trucks, before the excavation. She had been planning this since spring, working the structural drawings at her kitchen table in the evenings running the geothermal calculations twice. The call to Luis had come first. The trucks had come after. The piece of paper she found in October did not change any of that, but it changed something else. She had been moving things from the garage to make room for equipment boxes she hadn't opened in years, the residue of a life packed up and moved and never fully unpacked. And in the bottom of a rusted toolbox, she found a piece of paper folded into quarters. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded it. Robert had small handwriting, precise. The handwriting of a man who measured things twice and wrote them down carefully in case he needed to measure them again. She unfolded the paper. It was a sketch, rough done in pencil, the kind of sketch you make when you're thinking out loud with a pen in your hand and you don't expect anyone else to ever see it. A cross-section of a structure, thick walls, angled roof, a single door with multiple seals, ventilation slots at specific angles, dimensions written in the margins with little arrows pointing at each measurement. At the top of the page in his careful small handwriting, shelter, 2 people, long winter, build spring. He had planned to build it in the spring after the winter he died in. She stood in the garage for a long time holding that piece of paper, and she did not cry because she had done all that crying a long time ago, and she had made a private agreement with herself about how much of a person's life could be spent in that particular direction. She had already been right to call Luis. The paper just told her she had been right to be the kind of person who would call Luis, that Robert had been that kind of person too, that the instinct had lived in both of them, and one of them had not had enough time. She folded the paper back into quarters, and she put it in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt next to where her heart was, and she went back to the garage and kept moving boxes. The neighborhood predictably did not take the construction quietly. Flossie Karn organized the meeting. Flossie was 55 years old. She had the energy of a woman who had decided somewhere in her early 40s that civic engagement was the only acceptable outlet for her specific type of ambition. She was on the beautification committee, the architectural review board, the school fundraising committee, and the welcoming committee, which was ironic given how she treated people she didn't welcome. She was not a bad person. This is important. She was not a bad person. She was a frightened person, which is different though from the outside. It can look the same. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in October in the community room of the Ridge Road Library, which smelled like old carpet and good intentions. About 40 people came. Some of them were genuinely concerned about property values. Some were curious. Some just wanted to see what happened when Flossie Karn got going. What happened was she got going. It is an eyesore, she said. She said it like a verdict. It is a structural eyesore. It is an aesthetic violation. And it is... She paused for emphasis, visibly out of character with the valley's established residential profile. Mayor Desmond Karn, her husband, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He was 58 years old and had the look of a man who had learned through long experience how to be invisible in his wife's vicinity. People nodded. People murmured. Someone asked about setback requirements. And then Veradis Cole, who had been standing at the back of the room with her arms crossed and her face doing nothing in particular, walked down the center aisle. The room got quiet. She stopped at the front and turned around. 28 years ago, she said. Her voice was low, not soft, low. There is a difference. Soft yields, low holds. My husband and I were in a cabin 12 miles north of this valley. The weather service called for 2 inches. We got 4 feet in 6 hours. Straight line winds at 80 miles an hour. Nobody moved. The roof came down, she said. Robert was outside checking the generator. He was 30 feet from the back door. She stopped, not for effect, because some sentences take up all the air in the room and you have to wait for it to come back. He didn't make it back. The silence was the kind that presses. I survived because a beam fell on me. She said this as if it were a simple fact, which it was. I was trapped under a load-bearing beam for 6 hours, and I have thought about the engineering of that cabin every day since, about what held and what didn't, about why. She looked at the room. The houses in this valley, she said, are built for a view. They are not built for a winter. Your vaulted ceilings push heat 30 feet above your heads. Your gas lines will freeze when the ground temperature drops fast enough. Your windows. She glanced toward Daxwell, who was sitting in the third row with his arms folded, are your largest structural vulnerability in a wind event. Flossie opened her mouth. I know, Veradis said. I know. You have the Department of Transportation. You have emergency services. She nodded. Emergency services cannot drive through 10-foot drifts in a complete whiteout. I have read the incident reports from 4 comparable weather events in Colorado in the last 30 years. The average response delay in severe mountain valley conditions is between 14 and 22 hours. She paused. 22 hours is a long time to be cold. She looked at Flossie. Flossie looked back. Fine me, Veradis said. Sue me. I will pay the penalties, and I am finishing the build. She walked back up the aisle. She did not look back. Outside the library in the cold, waiting for her car, she found a small piece of paper tucked into her jacket pocket. She didn't know when it had gotten there. She unfolded it in the parking lot light. 1 sentence. No name. I didn't sign the petition. She read it twice. Then she looked up across the parking lot. Wanda Oglesby was walking to her car, 61 years old, Veradis's neighbor to the east. They had exchanged perhaps 40 words in 2 years, the usual border country courtesies about snow plowing and overhanging branches and whether the county would ever fix the drainage at the end of the road. Wanda did not look back. She got in her car, pulled out, drove away. Veradis stood in the parking lot and held the small piece of paper and felt something she had not felt in Crescent Ridge before. Not gratitude exactly, something older than that. The recognition between 2 people who have both learned through different routes that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply not add your name to the list of people trying to stop them. She folded the paper into quarters, put it in her breast pocket, next to the other one. Then she went home and read the barometer before she went to bed. The build took 11 weeks. Luis Vargas ran a crew of 6, good men, experienced, the kind of workers who didn't ask unnecessary questions and didn't make unnecessary comments and showed up at 7 and left at 5 and did exactly what the structural drawing said. Veradis was on site every day. Some days her hands were worse than others. On those mornings, she soaked them longer, 20 minutes, sometimes 30, and she wore her thicker work gloves, and she gripped things more carefully. She never mentioned it to Luis. She never mentioned it to anyone. It was not relevant to the work, and the work was what mattered. She and Luis had worked together before, years ago, on a commercial project in Pueblo. He trusted her drawings the way you trust drawings that have never been wrong. She trusted his crew the way you trust people who show up. It was in its way a complete relationship. The neighbors watched. Daxwell watched from his deck where the suede shoes gradually gave way to boots as the weather turned. He watched with the focused attention of a man cataloging evidence for a future argument he intended to win. He took photographs. He sent them to the homeowners association. He wrote an email to the county assessor. He did all of this loudly, in the way of people who believe that documentation is the same as action. The structure rose anyway. 3-foot walls of reinforced concrete, clad in riverstone rough gray, unpolished, aerodynamically sloped. The roof was a shallow dome designed to shed snow load rather than accumulate it. The door was a steel blast door, painted industrial gray. The ventilation shafts were louvered, angled, calculated to the specific wind patterns of the valley. There were no windows. This was the detail that seemed to bother people most. Not the concrete, not the granite, the absence of windows, as if a building without glass was a building without legitimacy, as if you only existed in this valley if the mountains could see inside your living room. Veradis had thought about windows. She had thought about them the way you think about something you've already decided against, for completeness. And then she had thought about Robert, and she had put the windows away. Inside the shelter, she always called it the shelter, not the bunker, not the structure. The shelter, she installed a closed-loop geothermal heating system. She had hired a contractor for the ground loop drilling, then designed the distribution system herself. 3 banks of deep-cycle marine batteries, LED lighting on circuits that could be individually isolated, a water filtration system fed by a cistern, shelving units bolted directly to the concrete walls, stocked with 18 months of dry goods and medical supplies, and 2 changes of clothing for every likely emergency scenario she had been able to model. On the roof, in a sealed, mechanized housing, she installed 2 things she told no one about: a xenon strobe light, military specification, high intensity, the kind that cuts through weather conditions that would blind everything else, and a foghorn, maritime grade, compressed air, 150 decibels, deployed in 10-second intervals. She had designed these for a specific situation. She hoped she would never need them. She was not optimistic about that hope. The Valley Tribune ran a piece on her in November. The headline was "Crescent Ridge's Doomsday Grandma Prepares for the End of the World." The reporter was 24 years old and thought this was charming. Veradis read the article 3 times. Then she cut it out with scissors, neat straight cuts, because she did things neatly, and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet that said Telluride, which she had bought at a gas station years ago and never thrown away. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the barometer on the wall, and she thought about a thing her father used to say in the tunnels when the survey data looked wrong, and the foreman was pushing for speed and the timeline was already 3 weeks behind. Slow is smooth, he'd say. Smooth is safe. He'd said it in the tunnels, and he'd survived 40 years of rock and dynamite and compressed air and the accumulated hubris of people who thought you could negotiate with geology. Veradis drank her tea. She watched the needle. December came in like an apology. Light snow, comfortable temperatures, the kind of December that makes a mountain town look like a painting of itself. The ski runs open. The restaurants filled up. People drove up from Denver with their families and their rental gear and their willingness to pay $11 for a cup of hot chocolate. Crescent Ridge was in December extremely easy to love. Daxwell Pruitt was washing his sports car on an unusually warm afternoon, 63 degrees in the second week of January, which felt like a gift and was not when he saw Veradis walking to her mailbox. "Hey," he called. He was in a good mood. The car was clean. The sky was blue. The mountains looked like a screensaver. "Hey, Veradis." She stopped. I think the only thing that's collapsing around here is your bank account. He said it with a grin, the grin of a man who believes he is being lighthearted, joshing, the grin of a man who does not understand that some jokes land differently depending on whether you are the person laughing or the person being laughed at. Veradis looked at him, then she looked past him, up toward the northern ridgeline. The sky above the peaks was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that makes you gasp, just the kind of wrong you feel before you see it. A color that doesn't quite belong, a bruised purple at the edges that the light was doing its best to ignore. And the air had gone metallic. She knew that quality of air. She had breathed it once before 28 years ago, and she had spent 2 decades hoping she would never breathe it again. She turned without answering Daxwell. She walked back into her house. She went to the barometer on the wall. The needle was moving, not slowly the way it moved on ordinary days. Ordinary pressure changes the usual rhythmic rise and fall of mountain weather. It was dropping, fast. The kind of fast that doesn't have a name in ordinary language. The kind of fast that structural engineers and meteorologists and search and rescue personnel have specific technical terms for. The kind of fast that in 30 years of reading barometers, Veradis had seen exactly once before. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass of the instrument, very gently the way you press your fingers to a pulse. She stood there for a long moment. "It's here," she said, to the empty room, to the barometer, to Robert. She said it very quietly, and the house held the words for a second, and then she turned and walked to the phone and called Luis Vargas and said, "I need you to know the shelter is complete, all systems operational. You understand?" And Luis said he understood, and they hung up, and she went to her bedroom and opened the small wooden box on her dresser, and she sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not take out anything. She just opened the box and looked at what was inside, a piece of paper folded into quarters, and she sat with the knowledge that she had spent 28 years building toward a moment that was now, by every instrument and every instinct she possessed, approximately 18 hours away. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen. She made dinner because she had learned in the years since Robert that the most important thing a person can do when everything is about to change is to eat something. She cleaned her dishes. She set the alarm for 5 a.m. and she went to bed in the house that had a barometer on the wall and a shelter in the backyard, and 2 pieces of paper folded into quarters, one her husband's and one a stranger's kindness. And she slept, not because she wasn't afraid, but because being afraid was not useful, and she had a great deal to do in the morning. The storm hit Crescent Ridge at 4:15 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. There was no warning that you would have recognized as a warning. One moment, the valley was the valley, the mountains, and the light and the snow on the ski runs, and the particular hush of a January afternoon in the high country. And then a wall of white, not a curtain, not a veil, a wall, an absolute opaque physical wall of snow and wind and pressure that simply erased the mountains and the trees and the ski runs and everything else, and replaced it all with a single color that was not quite white and not quite gray, but something between the two that has no name because no one who has experienced it wants to try to describe it. The sound. The sound was not a howl. People always say howl. Wind howls. It doesn't. Not in a storm like this. In a storm like this, it roars, physical and surrounding and without direction, because it is coming from everywhere simultaneously, like standing inside something alive. The temperature dropped 32 degrees in 45 minutes. 32 degrees in 45 minutes. Think about what that means for a glass wall. Think about what that means for the gas line running to the range in your kitchen, for the electronic igniter on your high-design gas fireplace, for the power grid fed through the substation on Ridge Road that had not been upgraded since 1998. Think about what it means to have built your home to be seen and then to be inside it when the world goes dark. In the shelter, the temperature was 70 degrees. Veradi sat in her chair and poured tea from the thermos she had prepared at noon, and she watched the monitors. The shelter had 6 external cameras in steel housings. 4 of them were already blind, the lenses iced over within 40 minutes of the storm's arrival, which she had anticipated. The 5th gave intermittent images, gray and chaotic, nothing useful. The 6th was thermal imaging. It pointed at Daxwell Pruitt's house. She watched the colors. Orange originally, the warm thermal signature of a heated interior. A well-lit, well-heated, extremely expensive home full of the particular confidence of people who have not yet been given a reason to be afraid. Orange, then yellow, then as the power went out the signature changed. Green, then slow and inevitable as a tide going out blue. The house was losing heat faster than she had modeled, which meant that insulation was compromised somewhere or the windows were leaking more than the specs implied, or both. She watched the screen. She drank her tea. She did not feel satisfied. She wanted to be clear about that, even with no one to be clear to. She was not sitting in her warm shelter feeling vindicated. She was sitting in her warm shelter feeling the particular weight of being right about something terrible, which is its own specific kind of loneliness. And then the thermal screen showed something she hadn't expected. The orange signature of the living room began to bloom, not fade, bloom, a concentrated, rapidly expanding thermal event in the center of the room, heat sudden and intense and wrong for the space. She leaned forward. She understood in about 4 seconds what she was looking at. "Oh no," she said, quietly, to herself, and she stood up. She knew what burning furniture looked like on a thermal camera. She had never hoped to see it, but there it was, the bloom, expanding, wrong shape for a fireplace, too fast, too concentrated in the center of the room rather than the wall where the hearth was, which meant Daxwell had dragged something chairs, probably wood, whatever he could find, and built a fire in a firebox that was never designed to contain one. Decorative gas inserts. Beautiful things, absolutely useless for burning actual wood. The flue wasn't rated for it. The glass front wasn't tempered for it. The heat differential between a panicked wood fire inside and -18 wind chill pressing against the outside of the window glass she was already moving. The steel locker was in the corner. She had it open before she finished the thought. The mountaineering suit was orange, expedition rated, -60 Fahrenheit. She had spent $2,000 on it 7 years ago, and she had worn it exactly once before tonight on a January morning when she was testing the shelter's exterior systems in a controlled storm. Her father would have told her it was smart. Her father, who had spent 40 years inside mountains, who understood in his bones that the thing that kills you is never the thing you were watching. She stepped into the insulated bibs, pulled the balaclava over her face, snapped the polarized goggles, laced the vapor barrier boots, already fitted, already adjusted, not something you wanted to figure out with frozen hands, strapped the climbing harness around her waist, checked the carabiner twice, The winch was mounted beside the blast door. 300 feet of bright yellow Kevlar cord, 550-pound test, spooled on a motorized drum, bolted directly into the concrete. She had run the anchor bolts herself, 12 inches deep, into bedrock. She clipped the carabiner to her harness D-ring. She picked up the canvas hauling sled, rolled tight, and tucked it under her arm. She stood in front of the blast door, and she thought about Robert. Not the night of the storm, not the silence after, something earlier. A Sunday morning coffee, him reading the paper and her saying something inconsequential, she couldn't remember what, and him laughing. The specific way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. She thought about that laugh, and then she pulled the lever. The door tried to kill her, not the door itself, the pressure differential. The storm had been building against the shelter's exterior for 2 hours, and when she broke the seal, the pressure difference grabbed the steel door and yanked it outward so hard that her arm wrenched in its socket, and she had to brace both feet against the threshold and pull with everything she had just to keep the door from becoming a projectile. The sound that came in was not sound, it was impact, physical, continuous, like being inside a freight train that is itself inside another freight train, high-pitched and structural and everywhere at once. She felt it in her teeth, in her sternum. The cold hit her face in the 3 square inches around her goggles that the balaclava didn't cover. -40, maybe more. The wind chill was irrelevant as a number, because no number meant anything right now. Only the body knew, and her body in the first 2 seconds of exposure registered a single clear message. This will kill you. If you are not careful, this will kill you. She stepped out, 60 yards. On an ordinary day, 60 yards was nothing. 20 seconds at a walk. The distance from here to there, the distance of a casual conversation across a lawn, a wave hello, a throwaway. In a bomb cyclone at -40 with 0 visibility whiteout and knee-deep rapidly hardening snow drifts, 60 yards was a different kind of distance entirely. 60 yards was the kind of distance you stopped measuring in feet and started measuring in endurance. She leaned into the wind at 45 degrees just to stay upright. The snow was not falling. That was the thing people who hadn't experienced this kind of storm never understood. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontally, tiny ice crystals moving at 90 miles an hour, which meant they weren't fluffy and soft and seasonal. They were sandpaper. Against any exposed skin, they were very small, very fast, very cold sandpaper. She kept her chin down. She counted steps. Behind her, the yellow Kevlar cord unspooled from the winch drum. She could feel its tension at her back. Constant, steady. In weather like this, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, which meant that cord was the only thing connecting her to the shelter, to the warmth, to everything. Lose the cord, lose the bearing. Lose the bearing, walk in circles. Walk in circles for 10 minutes in this cold, and you were done. Robert had walked in circles. She did not walk in circles. 15 yards, 20. Her left hand, the one with the worst arthritis, always the worst one, the one that needed the extra soaking in the morning, was going numb inside the glove. Not from cold, from grip. She was gripping the sled's rolled canvas with her left hand and holding it with the focused intensity of someone who knows that the moment you drop something in a storm like this is the moment it is gone forever. She kept gripping. 25 yards, 30. The wind came in a gust that was bigger than the other gusts, because storms like this have gusts that are bigger than the other gusts. and it hit her like something physical and intentional, and she went sideways 3 steps before she caught herself and found her footing again in the snow. Okay, she thought. Not a word she said out loud, not a thought she finished. Just okay, which is the word your brain says when the word it actually means is something much larger. 35 yards. The Kevlar cord unspooled. She kept walking. Her crampon hit something hard and slick. She dropped to her knees. She hadn't meant to. It was not a choice. The crampon caught the edge of something, and her balance, which had been operating on a very thin margin for the last 5 minutes, simply made its decision without consulting her. She was on her hands and knees in the snow, and for a moment the world was just wind and noise and her own breathing inside the balaclava, which was already beginning to ice at the edges where her breath condensed. She ran her gloved hand across the surface under her knees. Polished granite. Right. The outdoor kitchen island. Daxwell's outdoor kitchen island, which he had installed in the summer and which he had used approximately 4 times and which had cost more than a reasonable person spent on an actual kitchen. She almost laughed. She did not laugh. But the thing that would have been laughter if she'd had the breath for it moved through her for a second, and she was grateful for it because it was the most human thing she'd felt since she stepped out the door. She was close. She crawled the rest of the way. The ground under her gloves changed from granite to flagstone to the jagged, irregular texture of something that used to be a window frame. She felt it before she saw it. The sharp teeth of tempered glass in its failed state, the fractured aluminum of the frame, the threshold where a 30-foot wall of glass used to be and was no longer. She stopped. She felt carefully with both hands, and then she pulled herself over the threshold into Daxwell Pruitt's living room. It was not a living room anymore. It was a cave. An open, howling, snow-filled cave that happened to have Italian leather furniture and a media console and a coffee table book about architecture still sitting on the coffee table, now buried under 3 inches of snow. The wind came through the missing wall without apology. It rearranged everything. It took the curtains, what remained of them, and made them horizontal. It found the decorative objects on the built-in shelves, and it discussed them with the floor. The fire was out. Of course the fire was out. The implosion had taken care of that. When the glass went inward, it took with it every atom of heat the panicked little fire had managed to generate, and the storm had rushed in to fill the space. And now Daxwell Pruitt's living room was ambient outdoor temperature, which was approximately the temperature of a place where nothing lives. She turned on the shoulder-mounted flashlight. The beam cut through the blowing snow. She swept it left, right. She found him behind the oak dining table. He had pulled the table over on its side. Good instinct, actually. The best instinct he'd had all night, and was pressed into the corner it made against the wall. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, nothing else. The fleece was on the floor 6 feet away. She knew what that meant. She had read about paradoxical undressing in the same way she had read about every other failure mode of the human body in extreme cold. The moment the hypothermic brain shutting down its higher functions sends a false signal of overheating. The moment the dying person begins removing clothing. It was the thing that in the search and rescue reports was always listed without comment because there was nothing useful to say about it. It meant his core temperature was somewhere in the low 90s. It meant she had very little time. She crossed the room at a crouch into the wind, dragging the sled. His lips were the color of a bruise, not blue in a polite cinematic way, a true cyanotic blue. the kind that meant the blood had decided to stop making the trip to the extremities. His eyes were partially open, the wrong way, showing white. She didn't speak. Speaking wasn't the priority. She unrolled the canvas sled in 3 fast motions. She grabbed him by his collar and his belt. Dead weight, he was already past helping her help him, and she moved him onto the canvas with the specific graceless efficiency of a woman who has spent 40 years understanding how loads are transferred and how bodies fail and what matters in the 12 seconds when everything is happening at once. She pulled the thermal mylar blanket from her pack, wrapped him, duct tape, 3 strips. She had pre-torn the tape and stuck the strips on her sleeve because the time to prepare for the moment when your hands are cold and your fingers aren't working is before the moment, not during it. The blanket sealed. She clipped the front loop of the sled to the rear D-ring of her harness. She straightened up. She faced the open wall. She faced the wind. Okay, she thought, that word again, the one that meant something much larger. And she leaned into the storm and she pulled. Here is what nobody tells you about that kind of effort. It doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't feel like anything you've seen in a film or read in a story or imagined in the warm, comfortable chair where you think about what you would do if. It doesn't feel like resolve or courage or the music that should logically be playing. It feels like your body is too small for the task, like every cell in your legs is voting against this, like the wind has a personal opinion about whether you should make it back, and the opinion is no. It feels like your left hand, the arthritis hand, the one you soak every morning in warm water so it will agree to open, has stopped being a hand and become something else, a shape, a thing at the end of your arm that may or may not still be useful. It feels like 20 yards is a distance that cannot be crossed, and then you cross it anyway, because what is the alternative? Because Robert, because the yellow cord, because there is a man on the sled behind you who laughed at you 3 months ago and who does not deserve to die for it. No one deserves to die for a laugh, and you are the only person who is here in this specific dark and cold and noise who can do this specific thing. So you do it. 10 yards, 15. She was leaning so far forward into the wind that her body was at an angle that made no physical sense for upright movement. She was crawling more than walking. She was hauling 200 pounds of dead weight across ice-crusted snow on a canvas sled, while her core temperature bled into the storm, and her left hand reported with increasing insistence that it had opinions. 20 yards, 25, and then the cord went rigid. Not the tension she was used to, not the steady, gentle pull of the winch feeding slack. The cord went rigid and she jerked to a stop, and the harness grabbed her and nearly put her face in the snow for the second time tonight. She caught herself. She turned. She traced the yellow cord back with her gloved hands, following it through the white dark, and found where it had gone. The decorative iron sculpture in Daxwell's yard. She had seen it in September when the trucks were arriving and he was standing on his mahogany deck, a large abstract thing, iron branches reaching upward, expensive, atmospheric. The wind had taken the slack of the cord and wrapped it twice around the sculpture's lower branches. She pulled. The cord didn't move. She pulled harder. The sculpture was bolted to a concrete pad. It went nowhere. She stood in the storm and she did the math. Option 1, unclip from the cord. Free the cord. Find the sled again. Reclip. Continue. Upside it works. Downside the 10 seconds between unclipping and reclipping, she was completely untethered in a zero visibility whiteout. Completely. No bearing. no landmark, nothing. Option 2, drag the sculpture. It was bolted to a concrete pad and weighed 300 pounds. She pulled on the cord one more time in case she was wrong about the 300 pounds. She was not wrong. She took a breath. She found the carabiner at her harness. She pressed the gate, unclipped, and the world became very simple and very large at the same time. The cord was still there. She could still see it barely, a yellow thread in the white, but she was no longer attached to it, and the storm had no interest in this distinction, and the wind was, if anything, trying harder than before. She moved along the sculpture by feel, both hands on the iron moving around its base, finding where the cord had looped and catching the first loop and lifting it free. Second loop, her right hand slipped. She grabbed again. Got it. Free. She straightened up. She reached for the cord with her right hand and found it and held it. And she stood there for 1 second, one single second, in the middle of the storm, without being clipped to anything, and she made the deliberate decision not to think about what would happen if she let go. Then she found the carabiner with her left hand, the arthritis hand, the hand that needed 20 minutes of warm water before it would agree to cooperate. The hand that was at this moment operating at approximately 40% of its usual function. She felt for the gate, found it, pressed. The carabiner opened. She found the cord loop, clipped in. She felt the gate close under her thumb, and she stood in the storm, and she breathed for 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. Then she felt behind her with her right hand until her fingers found the canvas of the sled, still there. Daxwell, still on the sled, still breathing. She could see the mylar blanket, moving in her flashlight beam, the small, irregular rise and fall of a man whose body was trying very hard to remember what it was supposed to do. She clipped the sled loop back to her harness. She turned toward the shelter. She pulled. The shelter wall appeared out of the white in a way that seemed sudden, because it was sudden, because in whiteout conditions, distances don't reveal themselves gradually. They arrive. One moment, there is nothing, and then there is a thing, and the thing is right there, gray concrete, rough granite, enormous and solid, and utterly indifferent to the storm, in a way that made her want to press her forehead against it. She didn't. There wasn't time. She dragged Daxwell into the airlock. She hit the electronic winch release. The winch retracted, pulling the slack cord back onto the drum. She grabbed the blast door. She pulled it shut. The latch engaged. The sound of the storm went from everything to nothing in the space of 1 second. Not silence. The shelter was never completely silent. The ventilation system hummed. The geothermal system breathed. The battery banks had their own low electrical frequency. But after the storm, these sounds were so quiet, they were almost imaginary. She stood in the airlock and she did not move for a moment. She was sweating inside the expedition suit despite the cold. Her left hand was reporting things she didn't want to hear. Her legs had an opinion about what they had just done, and the opinion was unfavorable. She let herself stand there. 15 seconds. Then she hit the inner door release and dragged the sled into the shelter. The shelter smelled like concrete and dry goods and the faint metallic tang of the battery banks. 70 degrees. It had been 70 degrees since the geothermal system came online. It would be 70 degrees whether the storm lasted 12 hours or 12 days. This was not an accident, and it was not luck, and it was not something that had been handed to her. She had calculated it and designed it and built it in her backyard with her arthritic hands and her father's understanding of load and her husband's 28-year-old sketch folded in her breast pocket. She got Daxwell off the sled and positioned him near the main heating vent. She stripped off her outer layers. Her hands were shaking not with cold now, but with the specific tremor of adrenaline finding its exit. She had read about this. She had expected it. She gave it 30 seconds, and then she got to work. Scissors first. She cut away his jeans, not dramatic, just practical. You couldn't assess a wound through fabric, and she needed to assess this wound. The calf was bad. Not as bad as it might have been. The cold had constricted the blood vessels enough to slow the bleeding dramatically, a medically significant detail that meant he hadn't lost as much as the amount of frozen blood on his leg suggested. But there was a shard of tempered glass still in the wound, medium size, 4 inches maybe. She could see it. She flushed the wound with sterile saline from the medical kit. She opened the surgical forceps. She breathed once evenly. She gripped the shard, and she pulled it free in one continuous controlled movement, the kind of movement you can only make if your hands have enough experience with pain to understand that hesitation is the thing that makes it worse. The wound opened briefly. Blood, real blood, warm blood, a good sign welled up, and she pressed gauze and held it and counted to 60, and then she reached for the cyanoacrylate, medical grade, the same basic chemistry as superglue, used in field medicine for exactly this kind of wound, lacerations that need to be closed fast, without suture materials, by someone who is not a surgeon and is working by headlamp in a room that is not a hospital. She sealed the wound edges. She wrapped it in gauze, tight but not circulation compromising. She had thought about the difference between those two things. Then she went to the supply cache and pulled out the sleeping bag, minus 60-degree rated, double occupancy, which she had bought for a specific scenario that she had not been entirely sure she was being rational about at the time, and the chemical heating pads. She cracked 3 of them. 1 went in each armpit, 1 at the back of his neck, 1 wrapped in a thin cloth to prevent contact burns at his groin. These were the core rewarming points, the places where major blood vessels ran close to the surface, the places where heat applied carefully and correctly could begin to change the numbers. Not hot water, not a heating pad set to high, not the thing everyone's instinct said to do, which was to pile blankets on him and crank the heat, which would send cold, acidic blood from his extremities rushing to his heart before his heart was warm enough to handle it. Gradual, controlled, patient. She put him in the sleeping bag up to his chest, left his arms and lower legs outside the main insulation, zipped it carefully. She pulled her chair next to him. She sat down, and for the first time since she had pulled the blast door lever, she let herself stop. What she felt was tired, the specific tired that lives on the other side of controlled terror, the tired that comes when your body realizes it no longer needs to be an emergency and it would like to file a complaint about everything that just happened. Her left hand ached from the base of her palm to the middle knuckle of every finger. She looked at it. The fingers had gone their own direction slightly, the first sign of inflammation starting. By morning they would be stiff, and she would need 25 minutes with the warm water instead of 15, and she would not complain about this to anyone because she never did, and also because in the grand accounting of tonight, her hand was the least of the things she was willing to grieve. She reached into the inner pocket of the expedition suit, which she had not yet taken off because she had not yet stopped working. The paper was there, still folded, still in quarters, still warm from being next to her body all night. She held it in her palm, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Not while Daxwell's thermal signature was still the wrong color, and she couldn't let herself stop watching it. Instead, she looked at the monitor bank. The thermal camera on Daxwell's house showed a building in freefall. The whole structure was bleeding heat through the missing wall at a rate that made the mathematics simple and terrible. The floor, the ceilings, the furniture, all of it cooling toward ambient, outdoor temperature, which meant the house by morning would be a freezer. She watched the screen. She thought about the tulip bulbs Flossie Carn had planted along her front walk in October. She'd seen them going in neat rows, Flossie with gardening gloves and a trowel and the focused energy of a woman who needed a project. Those bulbs were under 5 feet of frozen snow right now. They might be fine. They might not. It was not possible to know from here. She thought about Wanda Oglesby. One sentence on a piece of paper, no name, the most efficient act of solidarity she had encountered in 2 years of living in this valley. She hoped Wanda had a house that was holding. And then she heard it, a sound from the sled, a small rough sound, like something catching, like a machine that has been off for a long time and is remembering how to start. She was out of the chair before she finished identifying it. Daxwell Pruitt coughed. It was not a polite cough. It was the cough of a man whose body had just remembered that breathing was required and was making up for lost time. It was rattling and uncoordinated and absolutely beautiful. His eyes opened, not all the way, the kind of open that was less conscious and more present. He looked at the concrete ceiling. He looked at the exposed conduit. He looked at the LED lighting strips and the steel shelves and the supply crates and the battery banks. He looked at her. Veradis. His voice was the sound of a gravel road in winter. Don't try to move, she said. You have a lacerated calf and severe frost nip in your extremities. Your core temperature was around 90 when I brought you in. He was quiet for a moment. The window, he said, thermal shock. The glass imploded inward. I was burning. Furniture in a gas insert. Yes. He closed his eyes, opened them again. The process seemed to cost him something. My house, he said. It came out small, the voice of a man who has just understood a thing from the inside that he knew about from the outside. The wall is gone, she said. The structure lost most of its heat through the opening. By morning, it won't be habitable. Something moved across his face that was not one thing. It was several things at once. Shock and grief and shame and the particular bewilderment of a person who has made a very expensive mistake and cannot go back and unmake it. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. Veradis, we laughed at you. I called you. You did, she said, flat, not unkind, just true. He was quiet. I'm sorry, he said again, quieter this time. I know, she said. She sat back down in her chair. She picked up the thermos. She poured him a half cup of broth, warm, not hot, the right temperature to accept, not to shock, and she handed it to him. He took it with both hands because one hand alone wasn't steady enough yet. She watched him drink, and then he remembered something. She could see it in the way his face changed, the sharpening of attention in someone who had been hazy and was suddenly not. Veradis. He said her name differently this time. Flossie. Flossie sent a message right before the cell towers. She said her roof was, she was going to Myron's. She said Myron had a generator. Veradis went still. Myron Hogue, she said. He installed it last month, but I saw it when he put it in. He didn't build an enclosure for it. It was sitting on the side of the house, exposed. She was already at the monitor bank. In this wind, Daxwell said. He was trying to sit up. He couldn't. He kept trying. In this wind, the intake would ice over. maybe 20 minutes. If the generator dies and they're inside that house without heat, Veradis, their kid, is 7. Pip is 7 years old. She stared at the thermal monitor. The Hogue house was a quarter mile down the road, in whiteout, in -40. She ran the numbers in her head in about 4 seconds. A quarter mile. In these conditions, with the cord she had, which was 300 feet, not a quarter mile, and the temperature dropping further as the storm aged, she had used significant core temperature on the first trip. Her left hand was already inflamed. Her body temperature was lower than she would like, and she had not eaten since 6 o'clock this morning. The math said you cannot walk a quarter mile in this and come back. She looked at the blast door. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the roof switch panel mounted on the wall, the red metal cover, the 2 toggle switches underneath, the xenon strobe, the foghorn. She had installed them for exactly this. Not for this exact scenario. She hadn't known about Pip Hogue, 7 years old, or Flossie Carn trying to survive in a house she'd hoped would save her. She hadn't known the specific geometry of the emergency, but she had known the shape of it. She had known that there would be a night when someone needed to find her and couldn't see, and the ordinary tools of direction, landmarks, street signs, the shapes of houses would all be gone. She had built a lighthouse because Robert had walked in circles in the dark, and she had spent 28 years thinking about what would have happened if there had been something to walk toward. She lifted the red cover. She looked at the 2 toggles. "What is that?" Daxwell said from the floor. His voice was steadier now. The broth was working. "Something I built," she said. She flipped the switches. Outside in the storm, in the absolute howling white of it, a light appeared. Military-grade xenon. High intensity. Not a flashlight beam, not a floodlight, a strobe, rhythmic, penetrating. The kind of light that gets through weather conditions that would stop anything else because it was designed for exactly that, because somewhere out there, people needed to find things in conditions where finding things was supposed to be impossible. The foghorn followed 1 second later, 150 decibels. Inside the shelter, it was a low, distant thud, a bass note, something you felt more than heard. Outside the shelter in the valley in the storm, it was a sound like the end of silence, like something very large saying here, "I am here, come toward this." Daxwell stared at the ceiling. She didn't know it would work, he said very quietly to no one in particular, maybe to himself. She just couldn't afford to be wrong. Veradis stood at the switch panel, and she watched the roof camera, which was still functioning barely through ice and snow, and she counted. She counted because that was what she did when she was waiting. She counted because Robert had counted once in a different dark, and the counting had mattered. The minutes passed. The strobe pulsed. The foghorn spoke. 10 minutes. Then 20. The strobe pulsed on the roof in its steady rhythm, cutting through the white in the way that only that specific kind of light could cut through the white, not by overpowering it, but by being different from it, by being rhythmic, by being the one thing in all that chaos that repeated itself at a predictable interval, which was the whole point, which was what distinguished a signal from noise. The foghorn spoke every 10 seconds. Daxwell had stopped trying to sit up. He was lying still with the sleeping bag to his chest and the broth finished and his eyes open, watching the ceiling, the way people watch ceilings when they are thinking about things they cannot fix. Veradis was at the monitor bank. She had switched between cameras twice. Most of them were blind now, ice over the lenses, progressive and complete. The thermal camera on Daxwell's house showed a building that had given up, a thermal signature collapsing toward ambient, gray and blue and inevitable. The airlock camera was the one she was watching. It pointed at the blast door's exterior, a narrow field of view, barely 10 feet, but 10 feet was enough if they made it that far. If. She did not say that word out loud. 25 minutes. 30. They're not coming. Daxwell said it quietly, not an accusation, a statement, the voice of a man who has recently recalibrated what he knew about certainty. Veradis did not answer, because she was still counting, because the foghorn was still speaking, because she had not built that system and bolted it to that roof and run those wires in November to stop using it. 30 minutes in, 35 minutes, and then the airlock camera showed something, a shape, not a clear shape, not a human-shaped shape, not the kind you'd recognize immediately, a mass, a moving mass at the edge of the frame, coming low, coming slow, coming the way things come when they have been fighting for a very long time and are almost done fighting. Then another shape behind it, then two more. 4 shapes, huddled together in a way that made them look like one thing with too many legs, moving toward the strobe's pulse, which they could see through the camera's limited night vision capability as a rhythmic flash painting the snow in blue-white intervals. Veradis was at the blast door before she had decided to go to it. She threw the bolts, all 3 of them, sequential, fast. She pulled the door. The storm came in with an opinion about that. Wind and pressure and the now familiar cold that had an agenda. She planted her feet and pulled the door wide, and they came through it, not walking, not quite stumbling, collapsing, falling across the threshold in a tangle of snow-caked limbs and frozen fabric and the specific gracelessness of people who have used everything they had just to get here. She pulled the door shut, threw the bolts. The storm disappeared. Again, that transition from everything to almost nothing. The ventilation system, the battery banks, the low frequency of a building that was designed to remain exactly what it was, regardless of what was happening outside. She turned around. On the floor of the shelter, in a heap that was slowly resolving itself into individual people, were 4 human beings. Flossie Carn, who had ice in her hair, not frost, actual ice. Her hair had been wet from what sweat or melted snow, and it had frozen into a solid mass around her face, framing her in a way that the beautification committee would not have approved. Her right hand was bare. She had lost a glove somewhere between her house and this door. The fingers of that hand were the color of old wax, bloodless, flat. Myron Hogue, 47 years old, father of 1. He had frostbite blisters on his cheeks, forming already the white, waxy patches that appear when tissue is in the process of deciding whether it will recover. His eyes were wild, not wild like panic, wild like a man who has looked at something enormous and cannot stop seeing it. Celeste Hogue, 44, pressed against Myron's side. She had her arms around something she was holding to her chest, something she had been holding the whole way, something that hadn't moved. Pip, 7 years old, bundled in Myron's winter coat, a large adult coat, wrapped twice around a small body, held shut with Myron's own arms, because there were no buttons and no zipper that would work at this scale. His face was the only part of him visible. The face was the wrong color, not blue, not exactly, the color of marble, the color of something that had been carved. Still, the particular stillness of a small body that has stopped fighting the cold because the cold has won the argument. He was not conscious. Myron looked up at Veradis. His face did something that faces do when the words that need to be said are too large for the available space. He stopped shivering 20 minutes ago, Myron said. His voice came apart at the end of it. Veradis. He stopped. He just stopped. She was already on her knees, 2 fingers against the carotid. She pressed and she counted. The pulse was there, slow, wrong slow, dangerously quietly, persistently slow. The pulse of a body that had made a decision to conserve, to retreat, to pull everything it had left to the center and hold it there and wait. 20 beats per minute, maybe, which was not enough, which was the number that meant stage 3, which was the number she had read about in the medical literature she had ordered from 3 different sources and read in the evenings after dinner with her tea going cold on the table beside her. She had read about it because she had thought, what if it happens? What if someone comes in like this? What do you do? Now she knew what you did. You did not panic, because panic was a luxury and there was no time. Listen to me, she said, steady. The low, not soft voice from the town hall meeting turned to a new purpose. He is in stage 3 hypothermia. He has stopped shivering because his body has run out of the energy that shivering requires. His core is still warm enough to save, but if we warm him wrong, we will kill him. Myron stared at her. Celeste made a sound. Afterdrop, Veradis said. Cold blood from his extremities, his arms, his legs. If that blood returns to his heart before his heart is warm enough, it will cause cardiac arrest. We warm his core, only his core, not his hands, not his feet. We leave those outside the insulation. She looked at both of them. Myron, Celeste. A single clap of her hands, not loud, precise, the sound of someone calling attention to the thing that matters right now. Take off your outer layers, down to your base layers. Now! Celeste looked at her, processing. Skin to skin, Veradis said. Your body heat, directly against his. It is the most controlled transfer of warmth available to us in this room, and it will not cause afterdrop because your skin temperature is gradual. Get in the sleeping bag with him. Hold him between you. Don't squeeze, just hold. Myron was already unzipping, because when someone speaks to you like that, with that quality of knowing that particular calm, that is not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let it drive you, don't stop to evaluate. You move because everything in your body recognizes that voice as the voice of someone who has thought about this longer than you've been afraid. Celeste peeled off her jacket. Her hands were shaking badly. She got it off anyway. Veradis had the sleeping bag open. She lifted Pip carefully. He was small and she was careful, and she positioned him between his parents the way you would position something irreplaceable. Arms outside the main insulation, legs outside, core centered, face clear. She zipped the bag to his chin. She looked at their faces over the edge of the sleeping bag. Hold him, she said. Don't stop, and tell me the moment you feel him move. Across the room, Flossie Carn was sitting against the wall. She hadn't spoken since she came in. She was holding her right hand against her chest with her left hand, which was the instinct hold. It protected, and the instinct was wrong. Flossie. Veradis went to her, knelt in front of her. Flossie's eyes were very large, not frightened exactly, something past frightened, something that had gone through, frightened, and come out the other side into a quieter country. She looked at Veradis. She looked at the concrete walls, the exposed conduit, the LED strips, the steel shelves with their neat rows of cans and pouches and medical supplies, the battery banks, the absence of windows. Everything she had spent a year telling a room full of people was an eyesore, a violation, a thing that had no business existing in their beautiful valley. She looked at all of it. Your hand, Veradis said, gentle, different tone than the one she used for medical instructions. Let me see it. Flossie opened her fingers. The right hand was bad, not the worst Veradis had seen in the literature, but bad enough. The 3 middle fingers were the wax color. The 2 outer fingers were still pink, which was better. The skin over the knuckles was beginning to show the first signs of a blister forming on the index finger. Superficial frost nip on 2 fingers, possibly deeper on the middle one. You're going to put your hand in water, Veradis said. She was already moving to the filtration tap, filling a basin. Lukewarm, not cold. I'm going to give you a temperature, and you're going to tell me if it feels right. She filled the basin, checked the temperature with the thermometer, 98 degrees, added a small amount of cool water, 95. Good. She set it in front of Flossie. Put your hand in, she said. Not slowly, just put it in, and listen to me very carefully. She waited until Flossie was looking at her. When the nerves wake up, it is going to hurt. I need you to leave your hand in the water anyway. If you take it out, you stop the rewarming, and you risk permanent tissue damage. The pain means it's working. Flossie looked at the basin. She looked at Veradis. Do not rub the skin, Veradis said. Not during and not after. Rubbing damaged frostbitten tissue destroys the cell structure. Surgeons amputate the fingers that get rubbed. So don't rub. Flossie put her hand in the water. She took a breath. She put her hand in and she held it there. The shelter held. Outside, the storm aged into something that was no longer building but was simply being. The sustained level of a weather event that has made its point and is now maintaining it. The wind speed monitor on Veradis's panel read 115 miles an hour for a while, then 110, then 112. Not improving, not worsening, just present, like something very large that had decided to stay. Inside, the temperature remained at 70 degrees. The geothermal system hummed. Daxwell was sitting up now, propped against the wall sleeping bag across his legs, the dressing on his calf, holding clean and white and correctly applied. He had asked for more broth, and she had given him more broth, and he was drinking it with both hands and looking at the room with the expression of a man learning to see something he had been looking at wrong. Myron and Celeste held their son. They held him without speaking, or mostly without speaking. There were small sounds, the sounds parents make when they are close to something they nearly lost, sounds that don't have names because they live below the level where language works. Veradis sat in her chair. She checked Pip's pulse every 15 minutes, 18 beats per minute at 11 o'clock, 22 at 11:15, 26 at 11:30. She counted each one carefully and wrote it in the small notebook she kept in the supply kit, and she felt the numbers change, the way you feel a tide turn, not dramatically, not all at once, but real, undeniable, the body making its decisions in the direction of continuing. Flossie sat against the wall with her hand in the basin and did not complain. This was significant. Veradis noticed it, because Flossie Carn, in Veradis's experience of her, was a woman who expressed herself about things loudly and organizationally and with a strong sense of civic duty. This silence was not the silence of a woman who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a woman who was processing something too large for words. At midnight, Flossie spoke. He drew up those plans himself, she said, quietly, not to anyone in particular. Veradis looked at her. Robert, Flossie said, you said in the meeting, you said you found plans he'd made. Before. Veradis was still for a moment. Yes, she said. Flossie looked at her hand in the water. The fingers were pink now, painfully, aggressively pink. The nerves were back. The pain was apparently being managed. Before he died, Flossie said, 28 years ago. Silence. And you built it, Flossie said. His plan. Veradis reached into the breast pocket of her fleece. She changed out of the expedition suit an hour ago when her core temperature had decided it was safe. She took out the paper, the one that had been there all night, the one folded into quarters for 28 years. She didn't open it. She just held it. I built it better, she said. Flossie looked at her, and something moved across her face, something complicated and true, the kind of expression that takes a lifetime to be able to make, that can only be made by someone who has loved and lost and organized too many meetings and planted tulip bulbs in October and held her own hand in cold water because a woman she had spent a year opposing told her to. I spent all year trying to make you small, Flossie said. It wasn't an apology. It was something more honest than an apology. It was an observation, a statement of fact from a woman who had decided that tonight was not the night for anything less than the truth. Veradis looked at her. You raised the hand you were signing the petition with, she said. Flossie looked down at her right hand in the water. Then she laughed. It surprised both of them. The laugh came out unexpected and genuine, a short, startled laugh, the kind that happens when something is both terrible and precisely true at the same moment. And then Veradis, who had not laughed in the shelter since she'd built it, who was not a person who laughed easily or frequently or without reason, she laughed too. Not long, not the kind of laughter that lightens everything and makes it fine. Nothing was fine. The house across the yard was ruined. Flossie's fingers were going to hurt for a week. Daxwell was going to need a surgeon and a contractor and probably a new philosophy. But the two of them laughed in the concrete shelter at midnight in the middle of the worst storm in 40 years, because sometimes the only response to the specific absurdity of the situation you've walked yourself into is to acknowledge it out loud, and that shared acknowledgement between two women who had been on opposite sides of a very stupid fence, that was the thing Flossie hadn't expected and Veradis hadn't planned for. That was the thing that turned out to matter. At 2 a.m, the shelter was quiet. Myron and Celeste had stopped making sounds. Good sounds. They had gone quiet in the way of people who have found a rhythm. Holding, breathing together, the sleeping bag rising and falling. Daxwell was asleep against the wall. His color was better. His breathing was steady. He was going to need a hospital in the morning, and he was going to be all right, which was a sentence Veradis could now form with reasonable certainty. Flossie had fallen asleep, sitting up, her bandaged hand resting in her lap, her head tilted to the right in the way of people who are more tired than they know. The shelter held its temperature, 70 degrees, as designed. Veradis sat in her chair, and she took the paper out of her pocket. She held it for a moment, and then she unfolded it. In the LED light of the shelter, clean and white and steady, she looked at Robert's handwriting for the first time since she'd found it. Small and precise, the writing of a man who measured things twice, the cross-section sketch, the thick walls, the angled roof, the door with multiple seals, the dimensions in the margins with their little arrows, shelter, 2 people, long winter, build spring. She had built it for 6 people tonight. She had built it for a 7-year-old boy who was alive right now because of it. She had built it for a woman who had signed a petition against it and was sleeping against the wall with a bandaged hand and a new quiet about her. She had built it better. She sat with that for a moment. Not the triumph of it, the weight of it, the specific complete weight of a thing that has been carried for 28 years and has now arrived somewhere. She didn't cry. She had made a private agreement about crying a long time ago, and she kept her agreements. But she held the paper for a long time, in both hands, the arthritis hand and the other one, and she let herself feel the specific texture of it, the fold lines soft from years of folding, the pencil marks slightly raised under her fingertips. And she thought about Robert, not the night, not the silence, a Sunday morning, coffee, him reading the paper, her saying something inconsequential, him laughing, the specific way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. She thought about that laugh for a long time. She folded the paper back into quarters, she put it in her pocket, and she kept her eyes on the sleeping bag. And then a sound, small, rough, the sound of a body remembering, then a full body shudder, the kind that comes from the hypothalamus, the brain's thermostat rebooting, sending the signal that it was time to generate heat again, a violent, involuntary whole-body tremor that shook the sleeping bag and made Celeste gasp, and Myron make a sound that had no word, and then a voice, small, very small, scratchy with disuse, and with the particular rawness of a throat that has been very cold and is now being asked to work again. Mommy, a pause. It burns? Celeste broke, not loudly, the opposite of loudly. She broke in the quietest way, which is the deepest way. She pulled her son against her chest, and her face went into his hair, and she made a sound that had been waiting for hours to be made. Myron put both arms around both of them. He didn't say anything. Some things don't work in words. Veradis sat in her chair, and she felt something move through her chest. She didn't name it. She just felt it move. By morning, the barometer was moving up. Small movements at first, the kind you had to watch for, but by 7 in the morning, the trend was clear. The storm was aging, not over, not yet, but past its peak, past the part that could still kill you quickly. At 9 in the morning, the wind speed monitor read 63 miles an hour. Still dangerous, still a storm, but no longer the same animal. At 10:30, it read 41. At noon, it read 22. And the roaring that had been a constant physical presence since yesterday afternoon went quiet, not silent. There was still wind. There was still snow. The exterior cameras were still blind with ice, but the roaring was gone, and the absence of it was so complete and so sudden that everyone in the shelter went still at the same moment and looked at each other. "It's over," Veradis said. She stood up. She looked back at the room. Daxwell, on his makeshift bed of sleeping pads, leg elevated, face a better color than it had been 12 hours ago. Pip sitting up now, actually sitting up, wrapped in the sleeping bag, eating crackers from the supply shelf with the focused attention of a 7-year-old who has decided that crackers are the most important thing in the world and should be consumed with full commitment. Celeste beside him, not sleeping, not talking, just being next to him in the specific way of mothers who have spent a night very close to a thing they cannot think about clearly yet. Myron standing, stretching, moving like a man testing that his body still works. Flossie at the supply shelf, looking at the organization of it, the labeled rows, the thoughtful spacing, the planning. She reached out and touched one of the cans with one finger, gently, like touching something to confirm it was real. Veradis watched her. Then she turned to the inner door. It took Myron and Veratus together to push the blast door open against the snowdrift that had built against it, shoulder to it, both pushing the door, grinding back degree by degree until there was enough of a gap for cold air to pour in and light real light winter light, white and flat and enormous, to pour in after it. They stepped out. Crescent Ridge was not there. What was there was what happens after. 10-foot drifts where the road had been. Trees, the big pines that had been on the ridge for 50 years, snapped at their midpoints like they were paper, not bent, snapped, clean and white and wrong. And the houses. They stood looking at the houses. Daxwell's house, they could see most of it from here, had lost the roof section over the main living area. It had come down in the night under the ice load. The interior was full of snow. The panoramic wall was gone. The whole structure had the look of something that had given up the argument. Further down Flossie's house, the exterior walls had buckled, not collapsed. The frame was standing, but the windows were all gone, and the interior was open to the sky. The Hogue house was invisible, completely. The snowdrift that had built against it had consumed it entirely, swallowed the whole structure under 10 feet of consolidated snow and ice, so that there was nothing left that looked like a house, just a smooth white slope where a house had been. They stood looking at all of this. Nobody said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say, because the mathematics of last night were visible in front of them, and the mathematics were simple and brutal and required no commentary. And then Flossie turned around. She looked at the shelter. The dome of concrete and granite sat in its place in Veratus's backyard like something that had always been there. Not because it looked natural, it didn't. It looked exactly like what it was built, deliberate, prepared, but because it had the quality of something that belongs to its place, something that has justified its presence. Not one stone missing, not one crack. The snow had built up on the aerodynamic slope of the roof and slid off as designed. The blast door was intact. The ventilation louvers were intact. The xenon strobe housing was intact, its mechanized cover closed now that the signal was no longer needed. Flossie stood looking at the shelter for a long time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. A week later, Daxwell Pruitt came back, not to his house. His house was not a place you could come back to, not yet, not for months. He came back to Crescent Ridge. He'd been at the hospital in Denver for 4 days. The calf required a proper surgical cleaning and 2 sessions with a wound specialist, and the frost nip on his hands required monitoring that he couldn't do alone in a hotel room. He came back on a Thursday. He came back to the community meeting that had been organized for storm recovery, insurance, temporary housing, the question of what to rebuild and how. 50 people in the same library meeting room that Veratus had walked down the aisle in 4 months ago and said, "Find me, sue me, I'm finishing the build." He walked in on a cane because the calf would need another 2 weeks before weight bearing was reliable. He sat in the 3rd row. He did not look like the man who had been washing his sports car in a t-shirt 3 weeks ago. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had been somewhere and come back changed and was still figuring out the geometry of the change. The meeting started. There were practical discussions, insurance assessors, structural engineers, real ones, the kind who came from outside the valley to look at things with fresh eyes, the county road department, temporary power solutions, and then Daxwell Pruitt stood up. He hadn't planned to stand up, or maybe he had. She couldn't tell, but he stood up on his one reliable leg, and he looked at the room and he said, "I was wrong," not at the end of a speech, at the beginning. before any context or explanation or qualification. Just, I was wrong. He said it to the room, and the room went quiet, and he said, I want to tell you what I saw, not the storm. I know you know the storm. He paused. I want to tell you what it looked like to watch someone pull you across 60 yards of whiteout on a sled, when you cannot help and cannot walk and cannot do anything except wait to find out if the person pulling you is going to make it. He looked at Veradis. She was sitting at the back of the room. She had come because the meeting was about the community, and she was apparently part of it. She didn't save me because she forgave me, Daxwell said. I don't know if she's forgiven me. That's not her obligation. He looked back at the room. She saved me because that's who she is, because she planned for it, because she planned for everything. A pause. And I spent months trying to make her stop. Silence. He sat down. That was all. No applause. No dramatic moment. Just a man who had been somewhere terrible, saying what he saw when he was there, which was the most honest speech anyone had given in that room in a long time. Outside the library afterward, the afternoon was cold and clear in the particular way of post-storm days when the sky has said everything it needed to say and has gone quiet. Flossie was waiting by the door. Her right hand was in a thick glove. She'd lost some sensation in the middle finger, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about its full return. Cautiously, which meant probably fine, but carry the uncertainty for a while. She'd been carrying it. She looked at Veradis. Veradis looked back. I want to ask you something, Flossie said. All right. The plans, the ones he drew. Veradis waited. Did you build it like he drew it? Veradis thought about this. She thought about the geothermal system, which Robert had not known about, the xenon strobe, and the foghorn, which he could not have imagined, the deep cycle batteries, the filtration system, the surgical-grade medical kit, the chemical heating pads packed in their precise locations. I kept the walls, she said, and the door. Flossie nodded slowly. Everything else, Veradis said, was mine. Flossie looked at her. Good, she said, and she meant it. A week after that, Myron Hogue showed up at Veradis's door. He had not called ahead. He was carrying a toolbox and a bag from the hardware store, and he was wearing his work jacket, and he had the look of a man who has made a decision and is not going to explain it unless asked. She opened the door. He looked at her. The roof housing, he said, for the strobe. I want to check the seals. Make sure the mechanism is going to function when you need it again. She looked at him for a moment. It might need it again, he said. You know it might. I know, she said. So. She stepped back from the door and let him in and made coffee while he got started, and they worked through the afternoon on the shelter's exterior systems, the strobe housing the foghorn, mounting 2 of the ventilation louvers that had taken minor damage from flying ice. He didn't talk much, neither did she. But when he was packing up to leave in the late afternoon, with the winter light going orange on the peaks, he stood in the shelter doorway, and he looked at the room, at everything she had built. Pip drew a picture of it, he said. At school, the assignment was somewhere safe. He drew this. He looked at the concrete walls, the shelves, the battery banks. His teacher asked him what it was, and he said it was his neighbor's house. And the teacher asked why he picked it, and he said, Myron stopped, cleared his throat. He said because the walls are too thick for the scary stuff to get through. Veradis looked at the walls. 3 feet of reinforced concrete clad in rough-cut granite, quarried by Luis's crew, designed to load-bearing specifications she had calculated herself, anchored into Colorado bedrock 12 inches deep, built to stay. She thought about what it meant to build something that a 7-year-old could understand, and she said the only thing that was true. Tell him he's right, she said. Tell him that's exactly what they are. In February, Mayor Desmond Carne delivered an envelope to her door. He stood on the step in his coat. He did not seem to know what to do with his hands. He held out the envelope. She took it. Full reimbursement, he said, for every fine and every penalty assessment from the past 12 months. The council voted. He paused. Unanimously, she held the envelope. She did not open it. Desmond, she said, Veratis. You told me back in October that you weren't going to let them shut me down. He looked at her. I remember. You didn't explain why. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the shelter, at the dome of stone and concrete in the white backyard in the February light. My mother, he said finally, used to say there's a difference between being in charge and being right. He looked back at her. I've spent 20 years being in charge. He shrugged slightly. I thought maybe it was time to be right. She looked at him. She nodded once. He left. She stood in the doorway with the envelope, and she looked at the shelter, and she thought about being in charge and being right, and the 28 years of distance between those two things that she had walked across, slowly carrying Robert's sketch and her father's knowledge and her own arthritic hands and her willingness to be looked at and found ridiculous. Worth it. Every fine, every petition, every leaf-etched glass of espresso held by a man in suede shoes who thought he was being lighthearted. All of it. Worth it. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and she looked at the barometer on the wall, her father's barometer analog, mercury column, irreplaceable. The needle was steady. High pressure, clear skies, the mountains visible from every direction in the way they always were after a storm had passed through and taken everything that was loose. She opened the small wooden box on the table. She took out the piece of paper. She unfolded it for what she told herself would be the last time she unfolded it in grief. The other times, there would be other times she knew there would be those would be different. Not grief, something else. The way you look at a photograph of someone you loved and it no longer cuts you open because the wound has finally, after enough years, become a scar. She looked at his handwriting. Small, precise, the writing of a man who measured things twice. Shelter, 2 people, long winter, build spring. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it. She put it back in the box. She closed the lid. She picked up her tea. Outside, the mountains were still there, enormous and cold and completely indifferent, the way mountains are, the way they have always been. They did not care about Robert or about Crescent Ridge or about Pip's drawing or the reimbursement check or any of it, but the shelter was still there too, in the backyard, in the snow, in the particular stillness of a February afternoon when the storm has passed and the world is putting itself back together, not one stone missing. Veratis drank her tea and watched the mountains and let herself for the first time in a very long time sit in a room that felt exactly like what it was, safe, designed that way, on purpose,